The atmosphere inside Catherine de' Medici's private chambers had grown so nauseating that even the most seasoned courtiers approached her only with perfume scarves pressed tightly against their faces. The Queen Mother of France, once the elegant Florentine princess, now carried with her an odor so overpowering that chroniclers described it as the breath of corruption. It rolled from her mouth not in faint whispers, but in dense waves, thick enough that candles flickered when she exhaled. In the next few minutes, you will discover the medical and historical evidence that reveals how one of Europe's most formidable queens became infamous for a bodily decay so intense that it entered diplomatic correspondence, court satire, and private physician memos written in terrified Latin. This is the hidden history of Catherine de' Medici, slow internal unraveling. To understand how the Queen Mother came to embody this living miasma of sickness, we must go back to the early years of her reign in France, when her power was still fragile and her body still whole. Because despite her later reputation as a master of poisons, political manipulation, and dark astrology, Catherine's greatest torment came not from the schemes of her enemies, but from an invisible corruption blooming inside her own mouth and gut. If you're interested in these dark tales, tap that subscribe button and join Rotten Angels community. Don't forget to let us know where are you located in the comments. Now let me take you back in time. Imagine the French court in the late 1550s. The Louvre, still half medieval, is a fortress of stone corridors echoing with the footfalls of servants. Catherine, now queen, consort. After the death of King Henry II moves through these halls with a poise born of long humiliation, years in which she had been considered barren, politically irrelevant. The foreign wife overshadowed by the king's mistress, Diana Poitiers. Now with her husband gone and her children ascending the throne one by one, Catherine steps firmly into the role of Queen Mother, determined to command France with an authority none can challenge. But even as she rises politically, something deep within her begins to break down. It starts with toothache, a swelling in the gum, a faint metallic taste. Upon waking, she complains of pain when chewing the sugar-coated almonds she adores, a delicacy imported from Florence to remind her of childhood. The pain grows sharper, more persistent. Her physicians apply pulses of vinegar and herbs. They prescribe cloves and fennel seeds. They massage her cheeks with warmed oils. But the infection spreads quietly beneath the enamel, carving abscesses along the roots of her teeth. By 1562, foreign ambassadors begin commenting not on her policies, not on her influence over her sons, not on the brewing religious conflict tearing France apart, but on her breath. A Venetian diplomat writes, "Her Majesty West's words escaped through a foulness so strong that I could scarcely endure it." The Florentine envoy reports the Queen Mother bears with her the odor of decay. It issues from the mouth and lingers in the air. At first, the court attempts to dismiss these remarks as slander. But those who serve closest to Catherine know the truth. When she speaks, the air thickens. When she laughs, the room recoils. Her ladies-in-waiting begin to carry small bouquets, pressed discreetly against their faces. Musicians learn to stand several steps farther away. Even Catherine herself, ever perceptive, smells the rancid undertone in her own breath. She becomes anxious, desperate to suppress it. That begins her obsession with perfume. She purchases more, ponders golden orbs filled with amber, gray, musk, and jasmine than any queen before her. She orders vats of rosewater to be splashed on the floors. Her gowns are impregnated with oils of orange blossom and bergamot at her pillows, stuffed with lavender. But no perfume can mask the truth. The infection inside her gums deepens, pockets of pus form beneath her tongue, her teeth already weakened by decades of sugary indulgence, loosen and darken. Surgeons are called to lance the abscesses. One couple releases a spray of yellow fluid so pungent that two attendants vomit beside the bed. Catherine, humiliated, demands they be dismissed, but not before she sees the horror on their faces. Still, she continues to perform her queenly duties. She negotiates with Calvinist leaders. She supervises the marriages of her children. She arranges treaties of war councils, but the damage is no longer contained to her mouth. By 1570, Catherine suffers from violent gastric reflux. The acids rise into her throat, scorching the already infected tissues. Each episode amplifies the stench. Now a blend of rot and sourness, so intense that courtiers whisper Catherine can wither flowers merely by speaking. Her digestive system begins to fail. She experiences bouts of nausea that leave her trembling. Her appetite wavers. Sometimes she gorges on candied fruits. Other times she cannot swallow a spoonful of broth. But Catherine refuses to acknowledge weakness. She orders new portraits, stern, commanding, immaculate. She hosts elaborate banquets she barely touches. She strides through her palace with her head, high silks rustling behind her, leaving a trail of perfume that cannot extinguish the sickly odor that follows her like a shadow. Historians often portray Catherine de' Medici as an architect of political violence, the mastermind behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. But few speak of the secret battle she fought alone. The physical decay that nor did her mouth, her lungs, her stomach, and finally her mind. By the mid-1570s, a subtle but unmistakable shift had begun to shape the court's perception of Catherine de' Medici. One that did not announce itself through dramatic collapse or sudden crisis. That through a slow accumulation of physical limitations, that even the most carefully orchestrated ritual could no longer conceal. Although her political authority remained formidable, her body was betraying her in ways that diplomats, servants, and even her own children observed with a mixture of concern. Letters from Venetian and Spanish envoys, written with the cautious precision characteristic, gradually shortened, and how the physical strain of long journeys, once an integral part of royal governance, left her visibly depleted. She had spent much of her life mastering the art of movement through power, the measured stride across council chambers, the controlled ascent onto her dais, the steady posture maintained during hours of debate. Yet by this period, those same gestures began to take on an air of exertion. Diplomats reported that she often paused mid-conversation not to gather her thoughts, but because she was fighting rising waves of gastric pain or the burning in her throat caused by chronic reflux. They noticed how she shifted the weight of her jaw in small involuntary motions meant to alleviate the relentless pressure of swollen gums. How she sometimes pressed a gloved hand discreetly against her cheek, as though momentarily overcome by the throbbing beneath the skin, and how the faint, sickly sweetness of her breath already remarked upon years earlier seemed to intensify after moments of particular effort, hinting at the internal inflammation that doctors of the period could not yet understand. The court, though governed by etiquette, was an observant organism. Servants whispered that the Queen Mother increasingly requested chairs during ceremonies that once required her to stand, that she asked for audiences to be held in smaller rooms, where she could remain seated without violating proceedings, that she rose later in the mornings and dismissed her attendants earlier at night. Pleading fatigue, her ladies-in-waiting who saw her without the armor of jewels and brocade wrote that her sleep had become shallow and fragmented, disrupted by bouts of coughing and the acidic regurgitation that forced her to sleep half upright. They noted too that her appetite had grown unpredictable. On Sundays, she devoured candied fruits and spiced pastries, as though seeking comfort, while on others she ate almost nothing, claiming that every swallow felt like fire travel. Perhaps the most essential tool of royal authority in a fractured kingdom became an ordeal. Catherine continued to insist on undertaking long circuits through the provinces, convinced that her presence alone could soothe tensions between Catholic and Huguenot factions. That these progressives want symbols of royal stamina and unity exposed her fragility. Reports speak of carriages frequently stopping so that she could rest her burning throat or steady her trembling hands. Of entire itineraries being quietly altered because roads were too rough or weather too cold for her declining health. In one letter, the Venetian ambassador remarks that she arrived at a council session pale and breathing with effort, yet proceeded to negotiate for 3 hours, refusing to yield even as the strain etched itself across her features. Despite these growing limitations, Catherine's instinct was always to conceal, not to retreat. She employed ever more elaborate layers of perfume to counteract the odor that she herself sometimes seemed unaware of, though others could scarcely ignore it. She commissioned new gowns with stiffer bodices that forced her to sit upright, hiding the abdominal swelling that made her feel, in her own words, inflated from within. She ordered her ladies to increase the frequency of room refreshes, burning juniper and rosemary until the smoke clung to the walls. Yet even these measures could not fully obscure the changes. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, began to falter. The chronic irritation of her throat left her hoarse, and she frequently paused to sip warm infusions meant to soothe the lesions deep in her esophagus. Chroniclers note that she sometimes spoke in a near whisper, prompting ministers to lean forward, an intimacy that many found increasingly difficult due to the pungent odor that accompanied her breath. Some diplomats learned to angle their bodies subtly away from her, a gesture that Catherine, with her acute sensitivity to humiliation, certainly noticed. What the court witnessed in these years was not a dramatic downfall, but the quiet erosion of a body forced to endure more than it could reasonably bear. And while no single moment defined this phase of her decline, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Catherine de' Medici, once the embodiment of Florentine discipline and royal endurance, was now fighting a private war against a body that weakened with every passing season. Even as she continued to shape the destiny of a nation with the last reserves of her strength by the late 1880s, the deterioration inside Catherine de' Medici had advanced so far that her breath was no longer a symptom. It had become a prophecy. Physicians noted that a sweet, putrid scent accompanied her even from a distance, a sign that infection had seeped into her bloodstream. Servants described it as a mixture of rotting fruit, metal, and something sulfurous. The queen herself began to sense it not by smell. Her nasal passages were too inflamed for that. But by the way, people's eyes glistened with involuntary tears when she leaned near them. Her body was failing on every front. The ulcers in her mouth deepened until they resembled small craters rimmed with yellow tissue. Her gums receded so dramatically that the roots of her teeth were partially exposed. Each tooth shifted in its socket with the slightest pressure. Chewing became a torment speaking required effort. Some mornings her attendants found drops of blood on her pillow, a sign that she had bled through the night. Her throat, scorched again and again by acid from below, developed chronic lesions that never fully healed. Swallowing water caused burning, swallowing wine caused agony to numb the pain. Her physicians gave her lozenges made of opium mixed with honey and resin. They dulled her senses but not the progression of rot. Her breath, once merely offensive, had now become unmistakably pathological. Muslim physicians in Spain, reading reports sent by diplomats, speculated she might have the smell of death rising from the stomach. An archaic way of describing kiddocytosis and systemic infection. Modern specialists would call it organ-level failure, ketones, ammonia. Bacterial metabolites entering the bloodstream, climbing up the esophagus and into the mouth. Her advisors, however, had no such vocabulary. They whispered instead, "The Queen Mother is consuming herself," and in many ways she was. Her digestion had collapsed into chaos. Meals passed through her as pain. Her abdomen swelled, unpredictably tense to the touch, as if inflated from within by unseen forces. Gastric fermentation produced belches so foul that attendants recoiled reflexively. Catherine, humiliated, would turn away, pretending to adjust her gown or examine a tapestry. But the shame deepened her paranoia. Her bowels alternated between violent purging and days of agonizing blockage. Surgeons attempted rudimentary enemas, while herbalists prescribed decoction of sienna, rhubarb, and licorice. Nothing restored. Normalcy, the queen's once steady. Hands grew ungovernable. They trembled when she lifted a cup, when she held a quill, when she gestured to emphasize the command. Letters from this period show erratic handwriting, the elegant curves replaced with angular strokes, blots of ink where her fingers sponged. Yet Catherine insisted on maintaining court ritual even when she was too weak to walk unaided. She demanded to be dressed in full regalia before receiving ambassadors. Her ladies tightened her corset around the torso, swollen with retained fluid. They powdered her face to conceal the blotchy discoloration creeping across her skin. They perfumed her hair so heavily that the aroma could be detected halfway down the hall. Still, nothing masked, the smell rising from her breath. By this stage, the stomach acids that had eroded her throat were corroding her voice itself. Her once commanding words now emerged as a strained whisper vibrate with mucus. Courtiers leaned in to hear her and immediately regretted doing so. The air around her mouth felt warm and damp, thick with volatile compounds that clung to their skin long after the audience ended. By 1587, the queen's condition had evolved into a grotesque symphony of symptoms. Her breath now carried a sweetness unmistakably linked to failing kidneys, a scent some physicians described as like apples left in a cellar to rot. Her urine darkened. Her limbs swelled. The underside of her arms developed, rashes that kept fluid. She perspired constantly. The sweat tinged with the same sour odor that rose from her mouth. Worst of all were the nights. Her attendants wrote that she awoke gasping, clawing at her throat, as if trying to pull the smell out of herself. She insisted the air around her had thickened. She accused the walls of closing in. She believed invisible forces pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Physicians blamed vapors of melancholy that modern medicine recognizes the signs of systemic sepsis, where toxins cloud the brain and induce hallucinations. Her paranoia deepened. She accused servants of poisoning her. She claimed enemies slipped foul odors into her chamber. She begged for fresh air. Yet when windows were opened, she screamed that cold drafts were killing her. The most intimate horror came when surgeons decided they must extract one of her teeth, a molar that had become a hollow cavern of infection. The operation took place at dawn with the room filled with bowls of burning incense. The surgeon tugged once, twice, and finally wrenched the tooth free. What emerged was not merely a tooth but a dripping mass of pus, blood, and decayed tissue. The odor that burst forth was so powerful that the surgeon dropped his instruments and staggered backward, gagging. Catherine fainted. When she awoke, she demanded the tooth be burned. By now, her breath had become a topic of diplomatic caution. Ambassadors were warned beforehand. Envoys wrote of holding their breath until their lungs burned. Some described audiences with her as more ordeal than honor. And yet Catherine remained unstoppable. She was a queen still, but a queen whose very speech carried the scent of approaching death, and those around her knew the worst was yet to come. By the winter of 1588, the French court had grown accustomed to the strange rhythms of Catherine diminishes decline. Her illness no longer startled. It saturated life at the move seeping into ritual etiquette and architecture itself. The Queen Mother's chambers were permanently perfumed with burning resins. The ceilings stained by constant incense attendants rotated in short shifts, not because they tired of service, but because the air inside her rooms made prolonged presence unbearable. Her breath, once merely foul, had become unearthly. What had begun as gum disease had evolved into full systemic decay. Every organ in Catherine's body strained under the burden of constant infection. Her kidneys faltered. Her liver. She begged her confessors to cleanse her lungs with holy water. She muttered prayers until her voice dissolved into a sickly wheeze. But the most terrifying episodes came at night. Her attendants recorded that Catherine often woke choking, gasping for air, thrashing so violently that her bed frame shook. She clawed at her throat, convinced some invisible force was pressing down on her windpipe. She begged for windows to be opened, but as soon as a cold draft entered, she screamed that it carried poison. Her breath filled the room with a heavy, suffocating sweetness, the unmistakable odor of a body drowning in its own toxins. Modern medicine calls this stage terminal sepsis. Her contemporaries called it something else. God's punishment. By 1589, the Queen Mother appeared far older than her 69 years. Her body swelled with retained fluid. Her ankles puffed until they resembled waxen stumps. Her fingers curled inward from inflammation. Her belly distended, taut to glossy like overripe fruit. She perspired constantly, the sweat carrying the same fetid odor as her breath. Still, she refused to withdraw from politics. But every strained exhalation told the truth. France itself was unraveling. Civil war, assassination, rebellion. And Catherine, in her ruined state, tried to hold the pieces together. It was a grotesque miracle that she functioned at all. Then came the final collapse. On January 5, 1589, Catherine attended a meeting regarding the siege of Paris. Witnesses say she seemed unusually pale. Her breathing shallow, her voice little more than a whisper, muffled by cloth, pressed to her lips. She complained of a great weight in her chest. During the meeting, a violent coughing fit overtook her blood, flecked her handkerchief. Ministers froze. Catherine waved them off as though swatting at flies. Within hours, fever overtook her. She was carried to her bed, trembling with chills. Her breath now so potent that servants lit dozens of candles simply to mask the odor. When physicians approached, they paused at the threshold, bracing themselves before stepping closer. A pulse fluttered rapidly, her eyes rolled upward, her fingers twitched. She tried to speak but produced only wet rattling sounds. A lady soaked her lips with wine and honey, but she gagged. She could no longer swallow. The infection had reached her lungs. In her final hours, Catherine drifted in and out of delirium. She called for her children, none of whom came. She begged God for mercy. She muttered in Italian, French, and Latin. At one point, she sat bolt upright, staring at the foot of her bed, whispering the shadows have arrived. Shortly after noon, her breathing grew erratic, each exhalation slower than the last. The room filled with the thick, unmistakable stench of a body in its final chemical surrender. The attending priest held a crucifix to her lips, but she recoiled, as if the scent of sacred oil suffocated her. At 1:15 p.m., Catherine de' Medici released a long, shuddering breath. Those present later said it felt as though the room exhaled with her. She died propped upright on pillows, her face pale as wax, her mouth half open, releasing one final waft of the foul vapor that had accompanied her for decades. But even in death, peace eluded her body. Within hours, the smell escaping from her cooling flesh grew thicker, denser, almost tangible. Candles dimmed in her presence. Servants whispered that the queen was rotting before burial. The surgeons tasked with preparing the body worked quickly, their eyes watering, their hands covered with scented cloths. They found her internal organs swollen, discolored, and softened by years of chronic infection. The stomach was inflamed, the liver engorged, the kidneys mottled. The decay inside her mouth had spread into her throat and lungs. Her breath, her lifelong torment, had indeed been the air of internal death. As her body was shrouded and sealed in a coffin lined with waxed linen, the court scrambled to rewrite the narrative. Proclamations declared she had died peacefully, full of grace and dignity. Portraits portrayed her serene and unblemished. Priests spoke of her devotion and piety. But the truth preserved in letters, diaries, and medical notes hidden for centuries is the story you've just heard. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother of France, architect of kingdoms, manipulator of politics, and patron of perfumes, spent her final decades imprisoned in a body rotting from within her breath. The intimate breath of a sovereign became the scent of her decline, a reminder that even the most powerful flesh is mortal, corruptible, and vulnerable to the quiet, merciless work of time. And in the end, the woman who governed France's destiny left behind not the aroma of roses or ambergris she so adored, but the unmistakable odor of decay.